They arrested me at the border. They put me in the overnight detention center. And then the next day they deport me back to London and declare me a threat to national security. So at this point, I was the largest foreign investor in the country. I had $4.5 billion invested in the Russian stock market. Everybody said, "You're crazy going against Buchanan, he'll kill you." And the next day I show up to the office and there are 20 bodyguards that I didn't hire, that Edmund hired from that day on to protect me when I was going through this war with Vladimir Buchanan. Sergei was arrested, put in pretrial detention, where they then tortured him to get him to withdraw his testimony. So all the other oligarchs come to him and say, "What do we have to do so we don't sit in a cage?" And Putin says 50%. And at that moment, Putin becomes the richest man in the world.
Bill, welcome to the New Forum. Thank you very much for being here.
Great to be here.
So I would like to begin with a story from your second book, Freezing Order. At the beginning, you talk about an incident on the south side of Chicago when you were growing up that I think is incredibly indicative of your spirit at a very early age and your attitude towards conflict, injustice, and those that are seeking to take what's not theirs. Could you tell us that story to begin?
So it involves a flute. When I must have been about 10 years old, maybe even younger. My uncle, who was a mathematician, but he was an amateur flutist, and he gave me a very special flute. He gave me a sterling silver flute. And I never played any musical instrument, but I had this valuable flute, and I felt like I should play the flute. And so I became part of the school orchestra, played the flute, but I was very bad at it. And I was the last flute in the orchestra. I've got a very...
But you were in the orchestra.
Anyway, so I was playing the flute, and I would take my flute with me to school in the morning. And I lived on the south side of Chicago, which was and continues to be a pretty rough neighborhood.
This was in the 70s.
This would have been the 70s, yeah. And pretty rough neighborhood, and I was going to school one morning, and I was approached by three kids who didn't come from the immediate neighborhood. They came from the adjacent neighborhood, which was the particularly bad part of town. And they said, "What's that you have in your hand?" And I said, "Nothing." And I tried to sort of, it was clear that they were not approaching me in a friendly manner. And they kind of, three kids, they sort of surrounded me. I was maybe under 10, they were maybe 15. And they started struggling with me, and they grabbed my flute and ran away with it. And the neighborhood was next to the University of Chicago, and so there were on each corner there was a white police telephone. You could pick it up, and if you had trouble. So I went to the corner, picked up the police telephone, and the University of Chicago police came, and then the Chicago police came, and Chicago police said, "What happened?" And I said, "My flute was stolen." And they said, "Well, okay." And they took me home to my house. So there I was standing at the door, rang the bell, and with these two police officers. My mother opens the door. What's going on here? She's very concerned. And I said, my flute has been stolen. And the officers said, "We'd like to take a statement from your son." So we all go in. We sit at the kitchen. They asked me all about the circumstances of the flute theft. I gave them all the details. I described the perpetrators. They left. And my mother said to me, "That's the last we're ever going to hear from the Chicago police again." And I'm sure here in London, people would understand that sentiment. Anyway, so we go on with life, and about 3 weeks later, we get a call from the Chicago police. They say, we believe we found the three people who stole your son's flute. They said to my mother, "We'd like you to come with him to the police station to identify them in a lineup." And my mother says... Did
you understand what that meant at the time?
No, I understood exactly what it meant. I watched
you did? Okay.
Every cop show, everyone.
Yeah.
And my mother said, "No, we don't want to do that." And I said, "No, we absolutely do want to do that." And so I had a big conflict with my mother, and I was the winner of the conflict, and convinced her it was absolutely essential that we go down and have this participate in the judicial process. So we go down to the this law enforcement area. of Chicago, in a really bad neighborhood. There's the FBI, there's the Chicago police, there's the juvenile detention center, there's all this different stuff. And we go to the police station, and they have a one-way mirror, as you've probably seen in the movies. And I was with my mother and the police people on one side, and then there was a bunch of young people on the other side in this lineup. And I immediately identified, saw the people who stole my flute. I had one, 2, 3 out of, whatever, 10 people that were on the other side of the mirror. And then the police said, well, we'd like you to come and testify against these individuals. And my mother was absolutely not. We don't want any trouble. This is not what we want to do. I said, no, we absolutely do want to do this. And again, another struggle. I said, this is, we have to do this. This is the only right thing to do. They stole the flute. They've caught them. We have to testify. So, and then a few months later, it takes a long time, I show up at the courtroom. This is the juvenile courtroom of Chicago. And there are these 3 kids glaring at me as I'm on the witness stand. And I identify them. I tell the whole story. And apparently they've been caught red-handed with some other musical instruments. And the judge took this all under consideration and found them guilty, and then let them off on probation.
No.
But the the experience for me was that I really found this whole being a victim of a crime very awful, and I wanted to participate in the justice system, and it was very much of a formative experience, which I then it sort of tracked me through life up till today.
It seems very indicative of your character from a very early age to fight against injustice. And from character to your motivations, you grew up in a rather unusual family. Your grandfather was the leader of the Communist Party in America, and that really was the seed of your motivation down the line to then go to Eastern Europe. Could you tell us about your family history a little bit and those motivations?
So my grandfather, Earl Browder, went to Russia at the age of 27. He was a labor union organizer from Wichita, Kansas, and he was invited by the communists to come and check out the Soviet Union. And so in 1927, he goes to Moscow. He meets a Russian girl who becomes my grandmother. They have 3 children. My father was born in Moscow. And in 1932, he was then sent back to America from Russia to become the General Secretary of the American Communist Party, so to be the head of the American Communist Party. He runs for president against Franklin Roosevelt in 1936 and 1940, obviously loses. He is then imprisoned in 1941 in a highly politically motivated prosecution, pardoned in 1942. He's then expelled from the Communist Party in 1945 for being too much of a capitalist. And then he's persecuted during the McCarthy era in the 1950s for having been the head of the Communist Party of America. So this is my family legacy. I was born in 1964. When I was going through my teenage rebellion, as many people do, I was trying to figure out how to rebel from this family of communists, and I came up with this perfect idea, which was to put on a suit and tie and become a capitalist. There's nothing that would upset my family more than that. I become a capitalist. I went to Stanford Business School, and I graduated business school in 1989, which was the year the Berlin Wall came down. And as I was trying to figure out what to do with my life post-business school, I had this epiphany one day that if my grandfather was the biggest communist in America and the Berlin Wall has just come down, I'm going to try to become the biggest capitalist in Eastern Europe. And that's what I set out to do.
And this led you into the world of consulting. Straight out of Stanford, I believe, you started a Boston Consulting Group, focusing on their Eastern European business. And you came across an early company that was struggling in Poland, a bus company, and then went on to Salomon Brothers in their investment bank and moved into Russia. And there's a really great story that you share in your book about the first time that you began to realize how undervalued these Russian companies were and how one company was microcosmically representative of a far wider phenomenon in the country. How did that happen? How did that unfold, that process?
So I ended up at Salomon Brothers, 1992, just as the Russian privatization program is getting going. And I get this assignment. It's to advise the Murmansk trawler fleet on their privatization. Murmansk is located 200 miles north of the Arctic Circle. We'd been hired, Salomon had been hired to advise the management on the privatization. So I go to Murmansk. I get met at the airport by the head of this trawler fleet. He takes me down to the docks to check out one of their ships. And it's this enormous vessel. It's like 400 feet long. It's got nets on the top, and then they separate the fish on the next level, and they do all this stuff to the fish. And at the bottom, they actually have canning machines where they can.
It's a floating factory, basically.
A floating factory. And it was very impressive. And I said, how much does one of these things cost? He says, $20 million new. How many do you have in your fleet? 100. So 20 times 100, 20 million times 100 gets you to 2 billion.
Yeah.
What's the age of your fleet? Average ship is 7 years old. So I figure maybe that makes it half depreciated, $1 billion worth of ships. And I've been hired by the management of the Murmansk trawler fleet to advise them as individuals on whether or not to exercise their legitimate right under the privatization program of Russia to buy 51%. And I say, at what price is the government selling you 51%? And they said, $2.5 million. So remember, we have $1 billion worth of ships, and you can buy 51% for $2.5 million. You don't need to be a Stanford MBA or a Salomon Brothers investment banker to know that that's a good deal. And so I said to myself, I said, of course you should buy it.
Yeah.
But secondly, I said to myself, I don't know what I'm doing advising on this stuff. I should be investing in this stuff. And that's what I then set out to do.
I would like to thank the English Speaking Union and the team at Dartmouth House for hosting us here for this interview. The ESU is an international organization based in the UK that promotes public speaking, communication, and cross-cultural understanding amongst young people globally. They host a variety of programs and events aimed at furthering these skills, such as public speaking competitions, school workshops, and foreign exchange programs. The English Speaking Union was formed in the belief that more effective communication between nations would lead to improved global understanding. This belief still stands strong today. As communities become ever more multicultural and societies more divided, there has never been a greater need to understand different perspectives and opinions. In what ways can strong public speaking skills benefit young people's prospects?
Well, I think that my whole career as a fund manager, as a political activist, it's determinant being a good public speaker, because communicating what's going on is the absolute essential skill you need to have. And so I think that, and I should point out that I do a lot of public speaking now, regarded well as a public speaker, but I was a paralyzed, terrible public speaker when I first started. I could barely string 2 sentences together without fumbling. And so it's an acquired skill that anyone can master with the right amount of effort.
Can you give an example of a particular time when it's been important, maybe speaking in front of the Judiciary Committee or a number of other committees in Washington?
So everything that I've ever done in terms of getting justice for Sergei Magnitsky required public performances. As you mentioned, I spoke in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee, spoke in front of the Human Rights Committee, spoken many times in the British Parliament, spoke in the European Parliament. And otherwise, if you can't communicate, people won't do anything. And getting people to do stuff is how you change the world, how you make money, how you make the world a better place. It's sort of totally crucial skill.
And this was, as you were saying, as part of a wider program of privatization as Russia was switching from a communist to a capitalist country.
Yeah.
And you started doing a bit of research and realized how widespread this was. And they were giving each Russian citizen a voucher.
Yeah.
And then you realized that you did the maths on this voucher privatization program and came to quite an astonishing realization.
Well, so this was really crazy. They gave away a physical certificate, a voucher, what they call a privatization voucher, to every person in the country. At the time, the population was 150 million. And these vouchers were like cash. You could buy them, you could sell them, you could trade them, you could burn them, you could do anything you wanted to them. They were like a freely changeable, exchangeable instrument. And they developed a secondary market where people could buy and sell them. And they traded for about $20 each. And so again, I went through the math. There's 150 million people in the country, 20 million of vouchers. I mean, so $20 per voucher.
A voucher, yeah.
So 150 million times 20 gets you to $3 billion, which is the total value of the vouchers in circulation. And these $3 billion worth of vouchers were exchangeable for 30% of the share capital of all Russian companies. And so if you further do the math, that meant the market value of the entire country of Russia was $10 billion. And this is a country with 30% of the world's oil reserves, gas reserves, 10% of the world's oil reserves. There's aluminum, steel, fertilizer, car companies, telephone companies, banks, timber, everything. The entire country, all together, $10 billion. You couldn't buy a mid-sized Oklahoma oil company for $10 billion. You could buy the entire country of Russia for $10 billion. And that became the obvious thing for me to do, which was to invest in these vouchers so I could buy shares of these companies at this ridiculously low valuation.
So you left Salomon Brothers and you went on to start your own fund. Going off, for someone who's a bit younger who might see a business opportunity, might want to start their own fund, what was it like and what advice would you have for people?
Well, it was so glaringly obvious that there was a opportunity to do this because everything they traded for free. I mean, so why would I go and be an employee at Salomon Brothers where you're maxed out on your compensation when I could do the same thing on my own and the unlimited compensation? And it was obvious. I mean, it was obvious in the sense that either it was going to make an enormous amount of money or it was going to all go bust.
Was the danger also obvious at that point?
Well, the danger was obvious, but it was a different type. So the main thing I thought was that there was a danger of losing money.
Okay.
I never thought that there was a great danger to me personally or to those around me. I mean, we knew about murders that were taking place in Moscow, but it kind of felt like somebody else's problems. There was mafia. They were going after, Russian oligarchs and bankers and aluminum executives. But if I was sitting in some anonymous office in Moscow trading shares, no one's going to know that I was there. These were like guys with gold chains and, leather jackets and all this kind of stuff that, if they saw your money, they would come after you. But they didn't see my money, and so I was I thought anyways, immune from the whole thing.
How did you raise that money? Who did you go to?
Well,
how did you get your start?
So what happened was that when I was at Salomon Brothers, we invested about $25 million. So I left the investment bank where I was doing the advisory work, and I convinced the proprietary trading desk of Salomon Brothers to allocate capital. They allocated $25 million of capital to invest in these undervalued Russian companies. We invested the $25 million of capital. And then The Economist wrote an article about how cheap the Russian stock market was. And all of a sudden, all sorts of random people that we had never seen before all showed up all at once in a tiny little illiquid market and all wanted to buy the shares. And so the share prices of everything we bought went up 500% in like a matter of weeks. And so our $25 million turns into $125 million. And all of a sudden, I'm a hero on the trading floor of Salomon Brothers, and all these guys who were, hearing about me come up to my desk. And Salomon Brothers is a very rude place. People were not nice to each other, and these people who were maybe 15 years older than me were acting very deferential. They were saying, Mr. Browder, we understand that you're a very busy man, but could you possibly meet with my client, Mr. George Soros? He would like.
Wow.
He'd really be interested in hearing what you have to say about Russia. And it wasn't just George Soros. It was like Sir John Templeton, the head of Templeton Investment Management, Michael Steinhardt, who used to be one of the great investors of all time, Julian Robertson, the manager of the Tiger Funds. All these people, the royalty of Wall Street, all wanted to meet me. And so I went on this sort of world tour of the royalty of Wall Street on behalf of Salomon Brothers to meet these people. And I would tell them the story of how cheap everything was, and I'd show them charts and graphs, and they would say, God, this is amazing. How do we get involved? Can we give you some money to manage? And I said, I don't know. We just do this for ourselves right now, but let me find out. So we go back to the bosses of Salomon Brothers, and I say, George Soros wants to give me some money to manage. They say, great idea. Let's form a task force to study it. And so I go to the first task force meeting, and there's like 40 people in the meeting, 35 of them I've never seen before in my life. There's like the vice chairman of the firm, senior managing directors, senior directors, senior vice presidents, and me. I was an associate. And within like moments, and none of them had anything to do with Russia other than me.
They just wanted in on the action. They
see all this money getting made, and Soros and all this kind of stuff. And a big fight breaks out about who's going to get the economic credit for the business. And like the emerging markets group says it should be us, and the investment bank says it should be us, and the asset management says it should be us. And with investment bankers, the one thing I can say is that they're very, very talented at making very credible arguments about why they should get money that they don't deserve. And so all these people are making these incredibly great arguments about why they should get the money. And I had no idea who was going to win this argument about who's going to get the money, but I was 100% sure of who wasn't going to get any money from this whole thing, and that was going to be me. And so I get very upset by this whole situation. 3 days later, I slapped my security badge on the desk of the head of the trading floor, saying, I'm quitting, I'm going to go start my own investment fund. And so I go and start my own investment fund, and I go back to these people who had offered me money, and a few of them said yes. And that was how I got my first capital.
And one of them was Edmond Safra, and you went to see him. There's a great story when you went to see him with Benny Steinmetz in France. Can you tell that story?
So Benny Steinmetz, who's now a disgraced financier, but at one point was a very sort of powerful player in the markets, he was a client of Salomon. He was one of the people I had gone to see when I was on this world tour of the royalty of Wall Street.
One of the biggest people in the diamond business.
He was a diamond dealer, and and diamonds throw out a lot of cash. And he used the cash to invest, and so he said, "You want to start a fund with me?" And I said, "Well, Benny, you're a nice guy and everything, but you're a diamond guy. You're not a." And he says, how about if I introduce you to Edmond Safra? And for those people watching this show who don't know Edmond Safra, Edmond was he was probably the most prestigious private banker in the world. So what that means, private banker is someone who caters to the very, very rich. And he was well known there, and his name was gold in the world of private banking. I said to Benny, well, if you bring Edmond along, then that's a different story. And he said, okay. And I was working on the desk at Salomon Brothers, and I get this call from Benny saying it's like in the afternoon. He said, I need you on a plane to Nice tomorrow morning. Meet me at the pier at the Carlton Hotel in Cannes. I was like, what do you mean? He said, just be there. And I didn't have a day off or anything, so I next morning I called the desk, with a fake cough. I'm not feeling so well.
Very Ferris Bueller of you.
Put the phone down. I get an EasyJet flight to the south of France. Maybe it wasn't EasyJet. I can't remember. But anyways,
it would be a good juxtaposition if it were. Anyway,
and so I take a taxi from the Nice airport to to the Carlton Hotel. I get out of the Carlton Hotel and I'm wearing my wool suit. I'm all pasty white, and I'm walking along the pier, and there's all these European fancy people with like their swimsuits and their tans and beautiful girls and all this kind of stuff. And I don't even know what I'm supposed to be doing there. I'm there at the appointed time. I'm waiting at the Carlton Pier, and feeling very out of place and certainly not dressed for the occasion. And off in the distance, I see this boat coming towards me, and it's this like very, very fast speedboat. And I see Benny there, and he says, "Jump on," and I jump on the boat, and then we go from the Carlton Pier to the Bay of Villefranche, which is this nice little marina, and we park the boat, and then there's this black Mercedes waiting at the pier. It takes us up to to this house. This house is called La Leopolda. It's the most expensive house in the world. This is where Edmund Safra lives. And we pull up, and there's like 12 guys in black tactical gear with machine guns standing there guarding La Leopolda and Edmund Safra. And they kind of check us out, make sure we're legit, let us into La Leopolda. And I walk into this villa, and it's like the Palais de Versailles, privatized. So it belongs to Edmund Safra, and I've never seen such an impressive place, and it's priced accordingly. And I sit down in the living room, and Edmund comes in, and I tell him the story of these Russian stocks, and off the back of that meeting with Benny, he ends up allocating my first $25 million to what will become the Hermitage Fund, and I start investing in Russia.
And you started with a number of equities, but the first equity that really set you on your journey of going up against the oligarchs was an oil company owned by Vladimir Potanin. Am I saying that right?
Correct.
And you realized that, so you bought, as I remember, 1.4% of this very large oil company through your fund, and not long after, BP bought another 10%, and then your investment went up substantially. The company then, or the management of the company then, tried to illegally dilute your shares. What did you do about that?
Well, so this was it was an amazing story from start to finish. So, as you mentioned, I bought the 1.4%, and I think I put $11 million of the fund's money, which was a lot of the fund. It wasn't a very big fund when I did that, and it was, this Sedanco was like really undervalued. I did all the math, and it was like 90% cheaper than the next Russian oil company, which was like 98% cheaper than Exxon and BP. So this was just cheap on cheap on cheap. And no one had ever heard of it. I discovered it. It was early days. I did my own homework being on the ground in Moscow. All the guys in New York and London and Geneva were all just relying on people, the stockbrokers, who were telling them just to buy whatever the easiest thing to do research was. I did my own research, found this thing. I felt really proud of myself. And then all of a sudden, like 12 months later, British Petroleum, BP, goes in and pays a valuation for 10% that values my $11 million at like $120 million. And that is just like the best thing that could ever happen. I mean,
that's pretty wild. That's a pretty great 10x return, or almost 11x return, right?
On a big investment in my fund. And I was just feeling so good about myself. Safra was feeling so good about me. Other clients who had gotten involved were feeling great. There's nothing better. And putting the money aside, the profits, which were great, just being smarter than everybody else was really such a, to get there early, to figure it out, and then have everyone else figure it out after me. That was just the most rewarding part of the whole thing. And so it's just the best thing ever. But the one guy who was feeling really badly about it was Vladimir Potanin, who owned like 96% of this oil company. And there's this famous proverb in Russia. It's about the magic fish. And the magic fish proverb is, some villager is walking along the riverbank, and out from the river jumps a magic fish. And Magic Fish says, "Congratulations, um, I'm a magic fish, and you can have anything you want in the world. Just say the word, and I will make it happen because I'm a magic fish." And the villager is thinking, I don't know. I mean, should I have 1,000 bars of gold, or a castle, or I don't know what. I mean, there's just so many things I can't decide. And the magic fish said, any of these things are possible, but the one thing I have to tell you is that whatever I give you, I got to give two to your neighbor. And immediately he knew what to do. He said, then poke one of my eyes out. This is a very famous Russian proverb, because then, of course, then you poke both.
Yeah.
Everybody hates everybody. There's jealousy. There's everybody. There's completely. And so Potanin, when he saw me making this money, he wasn't patting himself on the back saying, I've just sold 10% of my oil company, that I continue to own 86% of the company at a valuation 10 times higher than it was a year before. No, he's not feeling about and the spectacular riches that he's got. He's just thinking about, how does Bill Browder, this foreigner, this nobody who wasn't involved with him in any way, how does he get to make this money? And he just was absolutely not going to allow that to happen. And so he came up with this scheme where they're going to issue, I think it was 242% more shares of the company just to themselves at I think a 75% discount to the market, or maybe higher, I can't even remember. So this is what's called a dilutive share issue. And what it means is that basically my $110 or $120 million, or whatever it was worth at the time, was going to go down by $70 or $80 million. And I was just so offended by this. Coming back to my flute story, I was offended by the losses that I was going to make. I was offended by the clients of mine that were going to lose their money, but I was just also offended by the brazen illegality of this whole thing, the injustice of the whole thing. And I decided I was going to, go to war with Vladimir Potanin.
And for reference, he certainly now, but back then, was the richest man in Russia, an incredibly powerful person.
And everybody said, you're crazy, going against Potanin, he'll kill you.
What did Safra say?
Safra said the same thing, you can't do that.
When you have slight tangent, Safra was to you a mentor, in a way. He was also a business partner and a friend. What's the importance for someone who's a bit younger of finding a mentor, and how do you know who is the right fit, but also someone of enough of a caliber that you'd want to ride their coattails?
Well, that was the thing. And so, he wasn't known to be the soft and cuddly guy or any of that kind of stuff, but he was the best in the business, and he was a legend. His name was like gold, and so I said to myself, I just want to be associated with that, because that's how you get good at stuff, is by being around the best people. And so I partnered with him, and I was very eager and pleased and proud to be a partner with Edmund Safra. And he generally doesn't partner with anybody. The fact that I was, everybody is an employee, never a partner.
That's an incredible seal of approval, I guess.
It was it was a great validation. and as a result of his partnership, all of his friends put their money into the fund, and we gained lots of new clients, because if Edmund says that I was good, then I must be good. So we end up in this situation where we're losing a ton of money because of this illegal action on behalf of this Russian oligarch. And I say, Edmund, we're going to go to war with this guy. And Edmund said, you're crazy. We're not going to go to war with this guy. He's an oligarch. You can't do that. And this was a very interesting thing, because I said, well, Edmund, you're not my boss. I'm not an employee. You're my partner. And I'm going to go to war with him whether you like it or not. And so you can either go along with me, or you can sit back, but I'm doing this. And the next day I show up to the office, and there are 20 bodyguards that I didn't hire, that Edmund hired from that day on to protect me when I was going through this war with Vladimir Potanin.
Wow. And you had a whole security protocol with a bunch of different cars, and these were like ex-Mossad bodyguards.
These were all ex-Mossad guys. It was crazy. Every time that I would go from the office to home, I would go into one car with 3 guys, one in the front seat, or two in the front, the driver, a guard, and then me. And then there would be a lead car and two sidecars, and we would go through this sort of convoy through the city. And the lead car would get to my home a little bit before the rest of us, and then they would scope out the roof of the buildings for snipers. They would look under the cars to see if there's any car bombs. They would then clear the stairwell to make sure there was nobody hiding out in the stairwell. And then they'd create a protective cordon, and I'd go into my apartment. And it was crazy. I've never seen anything like it. It was like, something out of the movies. And it was very uncomfortable, I should say, sitting in an apartment. And there were two guys sitting in the apartment all night with automatic weapons on their laps. Get up to take a piss in the night, and there's the two guys sitting there with their automatic weapons. And they wanted to know what time I wanted to go to work the next day. And if we didn't get exactly the time, because they had to line it all up and scope out the rooftops and all that kind of stuff, you can't just like wander out when you feel like it. Very stressful. Anyway, so I had the security team, and I went to war with Patanin. And the first thing I did was I called up any Westerner that was doing business with him. So there was BP that was doing business with him. There was Harvard University Endowment was doing business with him. George Soros was doing business with him, and a few others. And so the first thing I did was I called them up and said, listen, here's what's exactly happening to me right now. It's outright highway robbery. You should understand that you may be benefiting from this right now, but if this is what he's doing to me, he's going to do this to you.
Did they listen?
Yeah, they all did, and they all started like calling him and writing him letters saying, "You can't do this. This is outrageous." And I get a call, a really angry call from his chief lieutenant, a guy named Boris Jordan, who is a Russian American, and he calls me up. And Patanin couldn't believe this. I mean, he had been cultivating these people, inviting them to the south of France on his yacht, doing all this stuff. And here's some like nobody from nowhere, Bill Browder, who's like ruining his good name. And this guy, Boris Jordan, calls me up and like just in a frenzy of anger and says, "Bill, you're not playing by the rules." And I said, well, if you think this is not playing by the rules, wait till you see what I'm going to do to you next. And the next thing we do is go to the newspapers. And I go to the Financial Times. There's at the time, the bureau chief was a woman named Chrystia Freeland, who has now gone from journalism to politics, and she's in Canada. She's the deputy prime minister and finance minister of Canada. But back then, she was the bureau chief of the Financial Times. And most journalists were too afraid to take on the oligarchs, but she was really keen to take on the oligarchs. And I had an oligarch story. So I told her about how Patanin was ripping me off, and she writes this story. And all of a sudden, all the rest of the press gets interested. And it's really interesting. At this point, I thought maybe he would fold and stop doing the whole thing. But instead, he doubled down. And he holds his press conference, and he said, Bill Browder is a terrible fund manager. All of his clients should take their money away. He should have known that I was going to do this to him, which made even crazier stuff. And eventually we got the head of the Russian SEC involved, and he was one of the few honest bureaucrats I ever came across in Russia. His name is Dmitry Vasilyev, and he wanted to make a name for himself. And so after this scandal reached fever pitch, he then intervened, and he canceled this dilutive issue, the share issue, and I was brought back whole.
So you won?
I won.
Wow.
And I thought, wow, these oligarchs aren't as, omnipotent as everybody said.
Wow. And you continued to then, when you would invest in a company and find a case of corruption or asset stripping, poor management, you came up with a stealing analysis, and you'd use some of the same tactics to essentially shame the authorities into removing these corrupt actors, and as a result, the share price would rocket. And one of the most substantial examples of this was Gazprom, and that ruffled some feathers.
Well, so this is a sort of an Icarus type story, flying too close to the sun. So I started to think to myself, well, look how well we did at Sudanko. Let's try this out at some other companies. And uh, and so Gazprom was the biggest company in the country, trading at a 99.7% discount to the value of Exxon per barrel of hydrocarbon reserves. 99.7% discount per barrel of reserves. Why was it so cheap? Because there's a lot of stealing going on at Gazprom. The market assumed everything was being stolen. And so we said, well, how do we? Why don't we try to figure this out properly instead of just making a broad brush assumption? And but how do you figure out what's being stolen in a Russian company? It's not like there's a class at Stanford Business School where they teach you. So I decided I was going to make a list of the every single individual who I thought might have some knowledge about stealing at Gazprom. People who used to work at Gazprom, people who are competing against Gazprom, suppliers to Gazprom, government officials, ex-government officials. And I made a list of about 40 people. And then I contacted each of these people and I said, would you have breakfast with me? Would you have lunch with me? Would you have dinner with me? And they were like, who's this guy? Why does he want to have dinner with us? And I didn't give them my agenda in advance. And I don't know, like 35 of them said, sure, why not? And so I go to my first meeting. My first meeting is with a guy who was a competitor to Gazprom. He had a small gas company. And we sit down at lunch at an Italian restaurant called Dorian Gray, just across from the Kremlin. And we sit down and I didn't know how it was going to go. And I said, I want to talk about stealing at Gazprom. And I thought, is he going to get up and go away? Is he going to? And he like sort of lights up and leans forward. He says, oh my God, you can't believe the stealing at Gazprom. And he starts telling me these stories. And I have a little notebook and I'm starting taking notes and I'm taking more notes. And he's going through one example and then another example, and I'm just writing it all down and like turning the page, filling up. And we're like 2.5 hours into this lunch. He's barely touched his food. I've got another meeting. I've got to cut the meeting. I've got to like cut the meeting off because it's just didn't have time to carry on. And every one of my other meetings was just like that. And what I discovered was that everybody in Russia who wasn't included in the theft was so infurious that they weren't included in the theft that they wanted to expose the people who got all the money. And I filled up 2 really deep notebooks of all these anecdotes from all this lunches and dinners and breakfasts and desserts that I had with all these people. But I was sitting on this, what clearly was a treasure trove of stories, but what could I do with this? It's not like I could go to court and say, I had lunch with someone who told me something. I couldn't go to the media and say, some guy told me this over breakfast. And then it was all hearsay. It was all rumors. It was all, tittle tattle. But I knew that something huge was going on at Gazprom, and I wanted to be able to figure it out. And I was very frustrated because I couldn't figure out what to do next. And then one day my head of research, a guy named Vadim Kleiner, was at a traffic light in Moscow at Pushkin Square. And the traffic gets really snarled up in a lot of places in Moscow, particularly this place. And as a result, you could be sitting in your car for anywhere from like 10 minutes to an hour in this traffic jam. And as a result of that, these street urchins sell stuff to people stuck in their cars. Just all sorts of random stuff. They're selling cigarettes and women's pantyhose and pornographic magazine, everything and anything. And if you're sitting there and stuck in traffic, it's better to see what they're selling than just staring ahead. And this is before the days of iPhones where you could scroll through your Instagram. And so Vadim is there, and some kid knocks on the window, and he rolls it down, and he said, what are you selling? And he said, databases. Vadim said, what do you mean databases? And he said, he opens up his jacket, dirty jacket, and inside the jacket is all these discs. He says, what's that one? He says, this is the Moscow Registration Chamber database, which shows the beneficial ownership of all Moscow-based companies. This is something we've been looking for. And Vadim said, how much? $5. So Vadim gives him the $5. He buys the database. He comes to the office. He said, I've just bought the Moscow Registration Chamber database for $5. I said, I'm sure you've been ripped off. There's no way. This is before the days of computer viruses. We just put it into the machine, into the computer. And sure enough, it's the Moscow Registration Chamber database, which I can use to cross-reference a lot of the stuff that I've just been told in these meals. But most importantly, when we pop the disk out, there's a phone number to call on the front to get other databases. And sure enough, Vadim did get ripped off because all the other databases were $1. And we got the Federal Security Commission's database, we got the Customs Committee database, we got every database. And what we discovered was that all data is for sale in Russia. All secret data, all government data, all these people who collect data, and it's the most bureaucratic country in the world. And all these ministries collect this data, and the guys working in the ministries aren't paid any money, and so they have a side business of selling all the data for nothing. So we bought all the databases. I could then cross-reference that with all the stuff that I've learned from my notebook. And we discovered that in a period from 1996 to 1999, the management of Gazprom had stolen oil and gas reserves equal to the size of Kuwait out of the company.
Wow.
And that nobody even knew. That was the most impressive thing I've ever seen in my life. The amount of the gigantic level of stealing. However, the second most impressive thing I've ever seen in my life was that the oil and gas reserves the size of Kuwait only represented 9.65% of Gazprom's total reserves. In other words, more than 90% of the reserves were still in the company. So this is a company that's valued at a 99.7% discount to Exxon and BP because everyone thought everything had been stolen. And we've just proven analytically and mathematically.
And you were the only ones who knew at that time that this was the case.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So what do we do with that information? Well, to use a highly technical financial term, we backed up the truck and bought as much Gazprom as we could possibly get in our fund. We had a limit of 20% of the fund in any one security. I went back to the investors and I said, we have to raise the limit. We have to change the rules of the fund because we want to buy 30%. So 30% of our fund goes into Gazprom at these ridiculously low prices. And normally that's where you stop in your work as an investor. You find something, no one else knows about it. You figure it out. You go buy the security and you wait. But I was too impatient to wait. And so I took all this information that we gathered, this dossier, I broke it into 7 chapters. I gave the first chapter to the Financial Times, second chapter to the Wall Street Journal, third chapter to Business Week, fourth chapter to the New York Times, fifth chapter to Washington Post, etc. And each of them, they wrote a story about all the stealing going on at Gazprom. And as a result of those stories, you had then the Russian press then picked up the story, and they started writing stories. And as a result of those stories, then the parliament then began debates on whether it was a good thing or a bad thing for all the stealing to take place. More stories. On the back of that, Gazprom management hired PricewaterhouseCoopers, a big Western accounting firm, to write a report to say it was a good thing to steal these assets. More stories. There must have been like 500 stories written about all the stealing at Gazprom, a total scandal, international scandal. And then interestingly, this was right around the time that Putin had just come to power. And
so this was 1999?
It's 1999, going into 2000.
Yeah. So this was in the wake of the Asian financial crisis as well, and stocks were rebounding from the lows that they'd been at a couple of years ago.
So Putin comes into power, not back, he's the first time he shows up, and he's fighting with the same guys I'm fighting with. The oligarchs were stealing money from him, or stealing money from me, at the same time as they were stealing power from him. And I've never met Vladimir Putin or ever had any conversations with him. But he saw this as an opportunity for himself. And so he uses the scandal to step in. And he uses the state owned 51% of Gazprom, or had 51% of the voting rights of Gazprom. And he uses that to fire the guy who was doing all the stealing. And he replaces him with a new guy whose job it is not to steal assets. I stress the word assets because he could still steal other stuff, cash flow and so on. But just by firing the previous boss, the share price doubled. And then the share price doubled again, and kept on, and then doubled again, and then doubled again, and doubled again. And between 1999 and 2005, the share price of Gazprom went up 100 times. And this was a position that made up 30% of my fund. And so it completely changed everything. And of course, I got very excited with Gazprom going up. I did the same thing at the electricity company. I did the same thing at the savings bank. I did the same thing. And I became this shareholder activist exposing corruption everywhere I could go, feeling very good about myself.
I'd like to come on to a point in 2005 where you make a weekly trip back into Russia, and all of a sudden your visa is revoked and you are sent back on a plane to London. And that is where your problems really start.
Yeah. So Putin had this war, his own war with the oligarchs, and he decides to win his war with the oligarchs in late 2003 by arresting the richest oligarch in the country. His name is Mikhail Khodorkovsky. He arrests him, he puts him on trial, he allows the television cameras to come in the courtroom and film the richest man in the country sitting in a cage. So all the other oligarchs come to him and say, what do we have to do so we don't sit in a cage? And Putin says 50%. And at that moment, Putin becomes the richest man in the world. And I'm carrying on exposing Gazprom and all these other companies' corruption. But I'm no longer going after Putin's enemies, I'm going after his business partners. And so on November 5th, 2005, I was flying back to Russia. I'd been living there for 10 years. At this point, I was the largest foreign investor in the country. I had $4.5 billion invested in the Russian stock market. And I get arrested at the border. They arrest me at the border. They put me in the overnight detention center. And then the next day, they deport me back to London and declare me a threat to national security. When the Russians turn on you, they don't tend to do so mildly. They always do so with extreme prejudice. And so the first thing I said to myself is, just kicking me out is hardly a sanction. And so I then organized an evacuation of my staff. And then after they're evacuated, we sell down every security we have in the country. And I get my people out, and I get our money out successfully. And I thought, phew, that's a pretty crazy story. Didn't lose any money. No, everyone was safe. Sort of dusted off my hands and set up a fund to invest in other parts of the world. And I thought I was done with Russia. It turns out that they were just getting started with me. And what happened after that was that my office was raided in Moscow. 25 police officers raided the office. 25 more police officers raided the office of an American law firm that I used that helped set up our Russian investment companies. They seized all the documents connected to those investment companies from our law firm. And by the way, these were companies which used to hold all of our assets, but since we got all of our money out, they were empty, but they didn't know that. I hired a young lawyer named Sergei Magnitsky to investigate why these people are doing this. Sergei was 35 years old. He worked for an American law firm, Russian citizen. He goes out and investigates, and he comes back and says, I figured out what was going on here. The first thing that was going on was they wanted to steal all of your money, where you've got your money out. He said, however, the second thing they succeeded in doing. And what he discovered was that after I was expelled from the country and we liquidated all of our holdings in Russia, we had a huge profit. We had $1 billion of profit that year, and we paid $230 million of capital gains tax to the Russian government. And what Sergei had figured out was that the people who stole our companies, stole the documents to steal our investment holding companies, went back to the tax authorities, and they said there was a mistake made in the previous year's tax filing. These companies didn't earn $1 billion, they earned zero. They came up with a complicated, fraudulent way of explaining that to the tax authorities. Therefore, the $230 million of taxes that was paid previously was paid in error, and we'd like it back. They applied for an illegal $230 million tax refund on the 23rd of December, 2007, 2 days before Christmas. And it was approved and paid out the next day, Christmas Eve. It was the largest tax refund in the history of Russia, paid out in one day on a fraud on Christmas Eve. Sergei and I were convinced that this must be a rogue operation. And we wrote criminal complaints to every different law enforcement agency in Russia. I went to the TV, radio, newspapers exposing the fraud. And Sergei went to the Russian State Investigative Committee, which is their version of the FBI, and testified against the police officers who conducted the raid. And we sat back and waited for the good guys to get the bad guys. Well, it turns out that there are no good guys in Putin's Russia. Instead of going after the people who stole the $230 million of taxes, they went after Sergei Magnitsky. On the 24th of November, 2008, Sergei was arrested, put in pretrial detention, where they then tortured him to get him to withdraw his testimony. They put him in cells with 14 inmates and 8 beds and left the lights on 24 hours a day to impose sleep deprivation. They put him in cells with no heat, no window panes in December in Moscow, so he nearly froze to death. They put him in cells with no toilet, just a hole in the floor where the sewage would bubble up. They'd move him from cell to cell to cell. And the purpose of all this was to get him to withdraw his testimony against the corrupt police officers. And they wanted to get him to sign a false confession to say that he stole the $230 million and did so on my instruction. And Sergei was a man of incredible integrity and principle. And for him, the idea of perjuring himself and bearing false witness was more awful than the physical pain they were subjecting him to, and he refused. And as a result, they just ratcheted up the torture and the pressure. And after about 6 months of this, his health started to break down. He developed terrible pains in his stomach. He lost 20 kilos. He was diagnosed as having pancreatitis and gallstones and needing an operation, which was scheduled for the 1st of August, 2009. A week before the operation, they come to him again and say, "Here, please sign this false confession." Again, he refused. In retaliation, they moved him from the prison that had a medical wing to a maximum security prison called Butyrka, which is considered to be one of the most awful prisons in Russia. And for Sergei, there was no medical facilities there. At Butyrka, his health goes into a terrible downward spiral. He's in constant agonizing, ear-piercing pain. And they refuse him all medical treatment. He and his lawyers write desperate requests to every different branch of the criminal justice system saying, please give us medical treatment for Sergei. Every one of those requests was either ignored or denied in writing. On the night of November 16, 2009, Sergei Magnitsky goes into critical condition. On that night, the Butyrka authorities don't want to have responsibility for him anymore, and they put him in an ambulance, sent him across town to a different prison. But instead of putting him in the emergency room at this prison, they put him in an isolation cell. They chained him to a bed, and 8 riot guards with rubber batons beat him until he died. This was November 16, 2009. He was 37 years old, and he died. He left a wife and 2 children.
Wow. So what did you do?
Well, it was the most horrifying thing I could have ever imagined. I mean, my worst case scenario is that he was going to be sentenced to 7 years in prison, but for him to be killed I mean, it's just unimaginable. And if he hadn't been working for me, he'd still be alive today. And so I made a vow to his memory, to his family, to myself, that I was going to put aside all of my work as an investor, and I was going to focus all of my time, energy, and resources going after the people who killed him. And we tried getting justice first in Russia, but they completely circled the wagons. They exonerated, Putin got involved in the cover-up. He exonerated everybody involved. And so I went to the West. And I started to travel to Washington, Brussels, Berlin, everywhere. And I worked on a piece of legislation named after Sergei Magnitsky called the Magnitsky Act. And the Magnitsky Act was a piece of legislation to freeze the assets and ban the visas of the people who killed Sergei and the people who commit similar types of human rights abuses. And it got traction. The Magnitsky story was so powerful that when I told the story, it's the same one that I've shared with you, to 2 senators, Senator Benjamin Cardin, a Democrat from Maryland, Senator John McCain, a Republican from Arizona, I said, can we freeze their assets and ban their visas? And they said, yes. That became the Magnitsky Act. And it was totally bipartisan, Democrats and Republicans. It went for a vote in the Senate in November of 2012, passed 92-4, passed 89% of the House of Representatives. And on December 14th, 2012, President Obama signed the Magnitsky Act into law. Putin went out of his mind. He was so offended by this. He banned the adoption of Russian orphans by American families. He made repealing the Magnitsky Act his single largest foreign policy priority. He started going after me with Interpol arrest warrants and death threats and all sorts of other nastiness. But I wasn't intimidated, and nor were any of my colleagues in the Senate. And instead of repealing it, they made the Magnitsky Act global to apply to all human rights violators everywhere in the world in 2016. I went to Canada. The Canadians' Parliament unanimously passed a Canadian Magnitsky Act, 2017. 2018, the UK passed the Magnitsky Act. 2020, the European Union passed the Magnitsky Act. 2021, the Australians passed the Magnitsky Act. Kosovo, Norway, Iceland, Montenegro, the Channel Islands. We now have 35 countries with Magnitsky Acts all over the world. And this is now the tool that they use to punish the Russian criminals who invaded Ukraine. It's a tool they use to punish the Chinese officials organizing the Uyghur genocide. It's a tool they use to go after the Gupta brothers in South Africa who have stolen so much money from the South African government. It's become the go-to tool for human rights abuse and anti-corruption. I've come to terms with the thought that Russia is never going to recognize the heroism of Sergei Magnitsky until Putin is gone. But these laws, the Magnitsky Act, it's like a legal monument to Sergei Magnitsky and his sacrifice.
It's quite incredible. It's also the most prominent piece of anti-corruption legislation globally across all these different countries at the moment. And your latest book, Freezing Order, which I'll show to the camera, details this campaign and details how, as part of this campaign, you went about making sure that the Magnitsky Act was enacted, that the assets were frozen of these corrupt officials and businessmen in the West. Can you briefly share that journey and how you went about doing it, and also the volumes of money that are in the West that had been going through, whether it be a Danish bank or a bank in Montenegro or Cyprus, how much there was and how you went about freezing that?
Well, so we get the Magnitsky Act passed, but the other thing we wanted to do is make sure that the $230 million that Sergei was killed over, nobody gets to enjoy that. And so we spent a decade and a full-time team of investigators tracking down that money. And when we found that money, we found the details of the money, the wire transfer documents. We put together a criminal complaint and file it with the law enforcement agency of the country where that money ended up. And the money ended up in about 26 different countries. And we filed 26 criminal complaints, and of those 26 countries, 16 of those countries opened up criminal investigations, criminal money laundering investigations. And the idea was to have them freeze that money and seize that money. And as we were going through this process, one of the countries we discovered that had laundered a bunch of money, of the 230 million, 200 million was laundered through Danske Bank, Estonia. And we filed a complaint with the Danish authorities. We made a bunch of noise about it in the media. And we got contacted by the largest newspaper in Denmark called Berlingske. And they said, we've just uncovered a huge leak of information from Danske Bank. We can't make sense of it, but if we have your criminal complaint and all the details behind it, we might be able to see what other money has been laundered through Russia. And so we gave them a copy of our complaint. We tend to work with investigative journalists all over. They then compared the names of the companies, the accounts, et cetera, with their database. And they came back to us and they said it actually wasn't just 200 million of dirty money that was laundered through Danske Bank. It was 8.3 billion. So they published this story. It was one of the most well-read stories in the history of the newspaper. And Denmark, which is considered to be a very honest country, was at a sort of had some cognitive dissonance, because how do you justify being such an honest country with this kind of scandal? And so the head of the bank then was pressured to organize a proper investigation. And so he brings in an accounting firm, a law firm, a data analysis firm, and they spent a year doing an investigation. And they come back, they said it wasn't 8.3 billion, it was 232 billion of dirty money laundered through Danske Bank.
And that's just one bank.
This is just one bank. If you look at Deutsche Bank and Credit Suisse and UBS, and a few banks here, I think the number would be close to $1 trillion.
Wow. And of that, a large portion...
It's all dirty money.
But a large portion also belongs to Putin.
Yeah.
If you were in a room with Putin for an hour, just you and him, doors locked, what would you say to him?
I've got nothing to say to him. There's nothing to say to the man. I mean, he's a criminal through and through. This is all about him stealing. And by the way, there's one really important thing. Why is he in Ukraine right now? The reason he's in Ukraine is because I think he and these guys around him have stolen $1 trillion. And it's just too much money to steal in a country that's supposed to be a democracy. And he understands that people are going to be angry at him for stealing all this money. And the best way to deflect anger, Machiavelli 101, create a foreign enemy, start a war.
And he's done that on 3 other occasions.
Correct.
And as you point out in your book, his approval rating seems to go through the roof when he does that. This
is the way that he stays in power, is to start wars. And so the war in Ukraine is not a war about NATO. It's not a war about the Russian Empire. He doesn't care about, he's not a patriot. This is a war of a little man who's stolen too much money, desperate to stay in power, because if he ever loses power, he goes to jail and he dies.
And if he loses the war, will he lose power?
He'll lose power as well. So the best way to end this whole nightmare is to give the Ukrainians enough tools to finish the war in Ukraine, because then that will finish him off too.
You also mention in your book that Russia, through years of communism, a lot of individuals have lost their sense of identity, their sense of individualism. And perhaps that's one of the reasons when that happens in countries why people can ascend to become autocrats and dictators. What sort of circumstances, or what would the path to a well-functioning, perhaps capitalist society with rule of law can you see for Russia?
It's hard to envisage anything good for Russia, because there was a sentiment for many years, many decades. If you weren't stealing from the state, you were stealing from your family. And the other sentiment was that anybody who took any good initiative, who had any kind of idealism or aspirations for a better society, was sent off to the gulags and killed. And so now you've got this situation where criminality is the only thing that's rewarded. And so all the people who have good character are gone. And so it's very hard to see how this is going to work itself out.
Do you see how the war do you foresee negotiation? Do you foresee one side winning and one side losing? What do you foresee in that arena?
I don't think that either side has the capacity to win or lose. I think it's, the Ukrainians need much more than they have, and I think the West is not going to give it to them. But they have enough to make sure that Putin doesn't win the war. And so I think this war everyone asks me, how is it going to end? And my answer is it's not going to end. It's just going to carry on and on and on.
Because that serves his interest, just to prolong it?
Well, it's just the reality that neither side has enough of an advantage to win.
Bill, thank you very much for your time. It's an absolutely incredible story that you have.
Thank you.